Okay, let's start. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director here at the London School of Economics, the South Asia Centre. I'm delighted to welcome all of you this afternoon to our last online event for this academic year, which has been a very, very interesting and informative year of events for us, where we've covered different countries of South Asia. This online event this afternoon, which is a very special one, is going to end a string of events, but is also the second in a collaborative series that we are doing with LaSalle College of the Arts in Singapore. And I'm delighted to have Jeffrey Say from LaSalle as part of the event today. The series, before I speak more about our event, the series was actually conceived sometime in the summer last year between Jeffrey by Dr. Zara Jimaboy, who was then affiliated to LaSalle and is now at the University of Bristol, and me. And we were very keen to explore connections and interconnections between what is referred to as South Asia, the region that's referred to as South Asia today, and the region that is referred to as Southeast Asia. It's been a very, very productive and fertile collaboration. The first event in this series, which was in Michaelmas term, was titled Self and Space South Asian Diasporic Practices. And it discussed how the South Asian diaspora, South Asians, once they move away from that region and become diaspora, how they navigate their diasporic identity in these new locations. And we looked at food, education, art, lifestyle, and so on and so forth in the context of Southeast Asia by South Asians. We had Sean McLaughlin from Leeds, who spoke about the Muslim diaspora. We had Santini Poddar, who spoke about Zarina Hashmi's art and diasporic art. And we had Venka Purushothaman, who spoke on South Asian and Southeast Asian cross-cultural creative practices. And that session was moderated by Zara Jumopoy. Our event this afternoon, I'm delighted to say, is much closer to my own academic and research interests. It looks at the historical context from ancient and medieval times, or those are the categories, shorthand categories that we use. And I hope that we will have a very interesting discussion. I should add here, by way of a frank disclosure, that because we are the LSE South Asia Center, our events take the perspective from South Asia. But in fairness, we also have a very thriving Southeast Asia Center at LSE. And if you're interested, please do look up their website as well. And I'm delighted to say that we have an amazing lineup of panelists this afternoon who have joined us from various time zones, literally from the United States to Singapore, with a little island in between where I'm sitting at the moment. But before I introduce our speakers, I also want to say a very warm and heartfelt thank you to our audience who have shown incredible interest in this event since it was advertised. A lot of you have signed up for it. I know a lot of you are watching from different time zones across the world. So thank you very much for your interest and for your loyalty. We hope that you will be part of this very interesting discussion. The event, as you know, is being held via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube. You will see that the chat function is enabled on YouTube. Please do ask questions via that chat function, and I will pose questions to members of the panel once the initial remarks are over and we have time for discussion. You're very welcome to pose a question to an individual panelist, in which case please do mention their name, or you're equally welcome to pose a question to the complete panel and I will ask the question accordingly. You are also very welcome to tweet. And if you would like to tweet, the relevant Twitter handles are in the details on the YouTube page. And please do tag us. Our Twitter handle is @SAsiaLSE, which appears against my name. I should add here that had this event been a live on-site event at LSE, members of the audience at LSE have the right to ask questions without revealing their identity. in trying to remain as close as possible to that spirit, when I ask questions that you may have posed, I will not be taking your names. I know that the names are visible on YouTube, but I will not be announcing them. A recording of this event will be available from tomorrow morning on our website. And without further ado, it is now my very pleasant task to introduce the speakers. And we've had a quick chat just now and decided on an order of speakers. So the order in which I introduce them is the order in which they will speak. Each speaker will make initial remarks for about 10 minutes. And we will then have a discussion. The speakers are welcome to ask questions to one another or respond to things that each of them has, one of them or any of them have said. I need to mention here that one of our speakers, Professor Elizabeth Lambourne, is going to join in about 20 minutes from now, half an hour from now, around between 1 and 10 past 1 UK time, but she will be joining for sure. Our first speaker is Daud Ali, who is Associate Professor in South Asia Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, is a historian of early medieval South Asia, and has researched and has published extensively on historical connections between South and Southeast Asia. Vidya Dehejia is Barbara Stoller Miller Professor Emerita of Indian and South Asian Art in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, and has published extensively on South Asian and Southeast Asian art. Elizabeth Lambourne, who will be joining us slightly later, is Professor of Material Histories at De Montfort University here in the United Kingdom, and is an expert on Indian Ocean histories from 600 to 1500 AD, on which she has published several monographs and articles. Finally, William Dalrymple is a multi-award-winning historian and writer. His forthcoming book, The Golden Road, looks at the connected histories of South and Southeast Asia, particularly those emanating from India. And I believe today is the first time that William will be formally speaking about that book, so we are all looking forward to it. Our discussant this afternoon is Jeffrey Say, who is an art historian specializing in Singapore and Southeast Asian art histories at LaSalle College of Arts, with whom we are doing this event in collaboration in Singapore. And Jeffrey co-edited volume, Institutions, Intersections, Innovations, a Reader in Singapore Modern Art, is forthcoming. I'm now going to invite Daud to speak. Daud, you have about 10 minutes. And yeah, just remember to switch your microphone on. Thanks.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and it's a pleasure to be here with a panel of such eminent writers on the subject of South and Southeast Asian art and history. My remarks will mostly be of a general nature. I want to begin with what we might call a conundrum or a problem, which I think is chiefly responsible for some of the diverse solutions to that problem. In a certain sense, the problem is an insoluble one. We know from material culture, from paleography, from linguistic and literary cultures, from religious cultures, that South and Southeast Asia have had connected histories and contact interaction of all types of varieties since as early as the Common Era, and perhaps even earlier. The problem from the Indian side is quite clear that given such a long and sustained interaction, we have no explicit treatment of this subject in Indian sources that I'm aware of before the 12th century. And perhaps a little bit, I mean, I'm not an expert in sources after the 12th century, but I suspect it's pretty minimal there as well, which is to say that the evidence we have of palpable, the palpable evidence we have of interaction is not accompanied by a theory of that interaction. For example, like what the nature of that interaction was. We have to impute that in those relationships from the actual material evidence. There are a couple of exceptions. There is an expedition in the 11th century by a Chola king from South India to Kadaram, a kind of perhaps uncertain location in the Indonesian archipelago. There are guild inscriptions, merchant inscriptions peppered throughout the Southeast Asian archipelago and even mainland areas as far east as Guangdong in China. But all of this, as I said, is more palpable evidence of interactions rather than, for example, any developed theory or conscious recognition of this interaction on the Indian side, which could help us to designate what the motivation was for some of these interactions. Of course, trade would be there, okay, but we don't have anything like a policy of any Indian state about, a policy of trading with Southeast Asia, okay? We might be able to infer one in the Chola period, but nothing terribly explicit. No travel accounts like we have from China, from the Middle East. So the evidence that's before us has led to a kind of variety of theories, starting in the 1920s with the idea, partly borrowed from French scholars working on Vietnam and Cambodia, that there was a kind of mission civilisatrice that was undertaken by the carriers of Indian culture to, as it were, introduce writing and various, religious forms, religious and literary forms, linguistic forms into Southeast Asia. Obviously, there was a strong, not only Orientalist, but strong early nationalist inflection to these theories. And I think everyone here is probably familiar with what was called the Greater India Society, founded in Calcutta in the 1920s, which formed a platform for early Indian scholars and nationalists to essentially think about what it would be like to imagine Hindu or Indian colonies or cultural colonies in Southeast Asia. So these are some of the early paradigms for approaching the problem. They were largely problematized as the field of Indian, and it has to be said, Southeast Asian history grew up and came into its own in the 50s and 60s. And there was a move away from trying to see what used to be called Indochina or Southeast Asia as the repository of either Indian or Sinic Chinese influence, but rather a concerted attempt or a concerted historical and historiographical effort on the part of Southeast Asian historians to rethink that relationship. And there's been on the Indian side quite a lot of thinking about how one approached state development, religious development in Southeast Asia in relation to what was happening in South Asia at the same time, okay? In other words, many of the earlier ideas of what it was, let's say, Hindu imperialism or Indian colonies in Southeast Asia, kind of assumed the idea of a fully formed Hinduism or a fully formed Indic culture, which was exported then to Southeast Asia. I'll start with the Indian material, it's directly on from this, is that Herman Kulke noted in the 1970s and 80s that what was going on what he called the rim of the Bay of Bengal, its eastern and western rim, was a series of cultural developments which affected places like Andhra and South India, and Cambodia, and Borneo, Indonesia, for example, Burma, the Malay Peninsula, in similar ways, and that they should be seen as part of a continuous process, which suggests, in fact, that what we're looking at in Southeast Asia isn't necessarily the export of a fully formed Indian culture to these regions, but a process whereby certain cultural practices, certain religious ideas, certain material practices, linguistic practices are adopted both in regions of South Asia and regions of Southeast Asia at the same time. And that kind of approach, I think, has been very fecund. Another approach, which I think I probably, how am I doing on time? I haven't been looking.
You have about 4 more minutes.
Yeah. Another interesting approach, which has been pioneered posited that local cultures in in Southeast Asia became more historically palpable by their contact with South Asian elements of South Asian culture, which is to suggest that the spread of Sanskrit, for example, or the spread of Indic religion brings very forcefully into the historical record various forms of localized religion and localized culture, which previously wasn't palpable on the historical record in Southeast Asia, which is something very interesting. It's a very interesting perspective, because what it suggests is that the outcomes of quote unquote Indianization, is what the older generation of scholars used to call it, wasn't necessarily always a product that resembled in the end fully what the historical processes that may have evolved, let's say, in South India or in various parts of India that these ideas moved to, and that you actually get tremendous cultural diversity of local cultural formations at the very time that Indian culture actually enables that. Okay, and so this was, I think, one of the most sophisticated theories of the influence and impact of Indian culture in Southeast Asia, which is to say that it actually brought into relief localized cultures in different ways in different parts of Southeast Asia. So I think that these two paradigms, that of Kulke and his notion of a kind of modulated spread of certain practices, not simply from India to Southeast Asia, but across Southeast Asia and South Asia, roughly at the same time. It points to the fact that we need to question what we mean by Indian culture when it moves to Southeast Asia, that in fact it is not a fully formed entity, that it is evolving against the local context just as it is as it moves through South Asia. That's why we have variations of Hinduism and Sanskritic culture in all regions of South Asia. And the other, that essentially we need to think very carefully about what South Asian culture does in quote unquote, its export zones, okay? Which is to say that it doesn't always end up producing a product that in any way resembles what we might expect as South Asianists or people that are very familiar with what those cultural forms would be in various parts of the subcontinent. And so those are, I think, two legacies that I'd like to put out there for the discussion today by people that are more, expert in particular subjects of the field of Southeast Asian studies. So, that's where I'd wind up, but I can say a little bit more if you'd like.
Thanks. Why don't we invite Vidya to speak now, and then I'm sure you can come in later. Just one thing by way of clarification, because we sort of lost your voice slightly in between once when you were speaking after you talked about Kulke, and you mentioned the second paradigm. Did you mention any author by name, or
I did. We're having thunderstorms here, so I'm sorry for.
That's all right. Who did you mention?
O.W. Walters.
O.W. Walters. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Right. I'm now going to invite Vidya Dehejia, who is Barbara Stoller Miller Professor Emerita of Indian and South Asian Art in the Department of Art, History and Archaeology at Columbia University, and has published extensively on South Asian and Southeast Asian art. Vidya, please speak now. You have about 10 minutes.
Yes.
And you're going to show us a few slides.
I'm really delighted that Daud has laid out this conundrum that we are facing, and the way in which we absolutely have to impute interactions. I'm going to be focusing on the period of Chola rule, 4 centuries of Chola rule in South India, and try and give you some of the evidence that we have, and hope that the thunderstorms, which are here as well, do not interrupt me too much. Let me try and get a map on the screen so that we have something that we can focus on specifically. And forgive me for a moment while I try and get this organized. All right. Okay. I'm going to start with an inscription known as the Varus pillar inscription from Sumatra that was under the control of the largely Buddhist Srivijaya kings, dated in the year 1088 and engraved in Tamil. It indicates that the commercial port of Velapura, as it was known, not as Varus, today's name, on the northwestern coast of Sumatra, was under the control of a Tamil expatriate merchant community. The leader of that powerful merchant guild, known as the 500 of the 1,000 Directions, had apparently concluded a profitable deal of handsome fees in gold with a mercantile group that wished to use the facilities of his port, most likely and clearly en route to China. This guild, Dehejia, was the most powerful of 3 merchant guilds operating in Peninsular and South India. And their active presence in the Chola kingdom, right from the end of the 10th century and before, is known from several inscriptions. You have, for instance, this 500 of the 1,000 Directions took charge of an endowment of land at a particular temple. It handled an endowment of sheep to provide ghee for lamps at another temple. At several other temples, they appear to have been responsible for the construction of part of the stone temples. Tamil merchant guilds also employed their own troops to safeguard their valuable cargoes and protect them during their travels. And an interesting inscription that attests to this practice comes from Sri Lanka. Written in Tamil, it tells us that King Vijaya, he's the one who expelled the Cholas from Sri Lanka, that he then proceeded to place the security of his royal Buddhist monastery in the hands of Tamil mercenaries employed by one such guild, mercenaries known as Munrukai Velaikarars. So the trade scenario is the one that I'm focusing mainly on, and which seems to emerge in the context with very little evidence of anything else. China's silks and fine ceramics were much in demand in the Gulf states. The Chinese to the luxury goods, among which were Arabian frankincense, sandalwood from the Indonesian islands, black pepper and cloves acquired from across the region, and especially from India and Sri Lanka, and were then sold at several-fold profit to traders who stopped at these Srivijayan ports. And tribute from Srivijaya to China involved large quantities of these much sought-after items, and tribute bearers were given preferential tax rates at Guangzhou and other Chinese ports. When the Cholas showed interest in entering this controlled trading network, and why wouldn't they want to try and tap into a lucrative source of income, Srivijaya attempted to keep them out. Indian Ocean scholar Tansen Sen cites a Chinese document that indicates that Srivijaya intentionally misled the Song court of China by suggesting that the Cholas were mere vassals of Srivijaya. A vassal status would result in the Cholas being assigned a lower level of trading rights at Chinese ports. Crucial, I think, to this power play was the topographical fact that access to the South China Sea was restricted. There were two routes. Ships had to ply either that narrow 50-mile-long Straits of Malacca or the tiny Sunda Straits. These pinch points were both in the hands of the Srivijayan kings of Sumatra, who also seem to have controlled Kadaram somewhere in peninsular Malaysia, even though I've given it an actual star. From the point of view of the Cholas, in view of this tricky trading relationship, we need to reassess the motivation that lay behind, for instance, the construction of a Buddhist monastery by a Srivijayan ruler at the Chola port of Nagapattinam around the year 1006. And we also need to reconsider Rajaraja's assignment of the village of Anemangalam for the support of the Srivijayan Buddhist monastery. I think we may assume a pragmatic desire on both sides to maintain an amicable trading relationship. Actually, it says much of Srivijayan diplomatic skills that at the very time that its ruler built a monastery in Nagapattinam, he also built a Buddhist temple in China for the emperor's long life, asking that it be named 10,000 years of receiving blessings from heaven. Srivijaya sent several gifts to the Shiva temple in Nagapattinam during Rajendra's reign, aimed presumably at keeping the Chola rulers happy and quiet. In 1015, for instance, two agents of the Srivijaya king gave gifts to the temple at Nagapattinam. One erected a gateway, the other gave a collection of precious gems to be used, and I quote, for the purpose of a silver image of Nagayarathar, the beautiful lord of Nagapattinam, perhaps Shiva as victor of 3/4. 4 years later, a total of a large amount of Chinese gold, China Kanakam, was sent by the agent of the king of Kadaram Kidaram, earmarked to provide food offerings to the image of Shiva as Ardhanari that he had set up in the temple at Nagapattinam. In the year 1023, the Sung emperor, apparently prompted by the disruption of overland caravan routes, urged the Arab envoys to shift their trade from the overland route across Central Asia to the route via the oceans. In 1025, Rajendra Chola undertook naval campaigns against Srivijaya and Kidaram. these campaigns was certainly nothing to do with territorial acquisition. They were undertaken with the hope of, I think, loosening Srivijaya's dominating hold over the sea trade routes, with the hope that the Cholas might assume a more active role in the sea spice route to China, which was extremely profitable. We know from earliest times, from Sri Lanka, for instance, that the taxes paid were sometimes used in Sri Lanka for a Buddhist monastery in Chola period. Of course, it gave them more wealth to spend on their temples and other issues. This Chola naval engagement with Srivijaya was a literal power with long experience with the forces of the ocean. Our information about it comes almost entirely from an inscription of the year 1027 inscribed on the south wall of the great temple at Tanjavur. After recounting Rajendra's victorious campaigns within India that culminated in his march to the Ganges, it moves on to the naval expedition in which his very first conquest, as you can see here, is Srivijaya, and the last one is Kidaram. I give you this very sharply abbreviated version of the naval conquest. This was no decisive victory. It appears to have been little more than a raid with temporary success. 50 years later, an inscription refers to the Chola king of the time, Kulothunga I, as he who conquered Kidaram. Clearly, these holdings, international holdings, were fluid, changing with the fortunes and ambitions of individual Chola rulers who repeatedly attempted to become players of consequence along the spice route, the route of the sea. So too with the Nagapattinam Buddhist monastery of those Srivijaya kings. In 1092, ambassadors from the king of Kidaram request the current king, Kulothunga, to renew the grant of the villages originally gifted by Rajaraja. Obviously, the grant had been allowed to lapse in the interim period of naval raids, conflicting, I guess, ambitions and diverging objectives. Let me conclude with an inscription that speaks of the crucial importance of ocean trade, not only for the Cholas, but also for several of their rivals, in this case, the rulers of the Kakatiya dynasty. In a remarkable inscription of the year 1244 at the port of Motupalli in the Krishna River Delta, Kakatiya King Ganapati issued a safety edict that was intended to induce, and I quote, traders by sea starting for and arriving from all continents, islands, foreign countries, and cities, end quote, to come further north, dock in ports along the coastline of his kingdom. And what does King Ganapati do? He highlights the fact that shipwrecked traders, interesting, shipwrecks were frequent, obviously. He highlights the fact that shipwrecked traders normally lost all their cargo to the powers that controlled the area where they were stranded. And his edict guarantees the safety of traders and assures them that he will levy only the standard duty on their cargo at the accepted rate of 1 in 30. So as Daud said at the beginning, our evidence is very meager. We need to impute interactions. We don't have those wonderful sort of travel diaries that would help us so much and which we would love to find. They don't seem to exist. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Vidya. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm going to quickly welcome Elizabeth. Elizabeth, welcome. We all know, and I announced at the beginning of the event that you were in another event, and so thank you very much for ending that and joining this. Before I introduce Elizabeth, who is our next speaker, could I just mention once again to members of the audience who are watching that you're very welcome to ask questions via the chat function on YouTube. Please feel free to ask that. You're welcome to ask a question to an individual panelist. You're also welcome to pose a question to the complete panel, which we'll take up later. Elizabeth Lambourne is Professor of Material Histories at De Montfort University here in the United Kingdom and is an expert on Indian Ocean histories from AD 600 to 1500 in particular, on which she has published extensively. Elizabeth, please speak now. We've given you a screen sharing right, so you should be able to share your screen, and you have about 10 minutes.
Lovely, thank you very much. Let me just get set up. I have to apologise for disruption caused by arriving late. But I am now, let me just open my PowerPoint. So as I wait for my tardy PowerPoint to open, which should get there eventually, I just wanted to say I'm going to intervene quite simply today, thinking about a category of evidence that until recently was very neglected and is coming to the forefront, I'd say more now. And it's worth it's material that I worked on my PhD many moons ago now, but that I feel it's probably worth reintroducing in this context and sharing with you. So there we go. Perfect. Can everybody see that okay now?
Yes, this is perfect, thank you.
Perfect, lovely, apologies. So, yes, long neglected, but really plentiful across Southeast Asia, we have vast Islamic cemeteries. Many, as you can see in this picture, are uninscribed, but from, comparatively early on, so we're talking, 19th century onwards, it was realized that quite a number were inscribed, sometimes with inscriptions going back potentially to the 11th century or before. And there was, for a long time, a heavily epigraphic approach to this material, bring it, very much into the category of dematerialized text is what I would call it. From the 90s onwards, I and others began to really think a lot more then about the relationship of text to the actual object, the forms of graves, the materials used, calligraphy styles and things like that, and to develop a rather more holistic approach to what these monuments and sometimes very small insignificant pieces of stone could actually offer in terms of insights to history, and to go beyond this permanent search for a date, a name, ideally a royal name, and then the constitution of some kind of Muslim genealogy of kingship for a particular area. So since I worked on this material as part of my PhD and then published on it in the early 2000s, I'd say, one of the biggest groups really taking this area forward and that need to be mentioned is the Maritime Asia Heritage Survey that's Arcadia funded and now based at the University of Kyoto under Michael Fina. So you have the web link there for them. And as you can see, they have been documenting all kinds of heritage, not simply tombstones, from the Maldives right through to the eastern Indonesian archipelago and also in Vietnam. And the great advantage, of course, of working now is that a lot of this material is now online. I wouldn't be fair if I didn't mention that about the time I was working on this material, the 2000 onwards, the École Française d'Extrême-Orient was extremely active, particularly in Malaysia under Daniel Perret, who did really extensive systematic documentation of cemeteries and brilliantly documented tombstones, even if they weren't inscribed, even if they weren't decorated, he'd still record them. But that material was published in traditional print form, and obviously it hasn't failed to reach quite the same audience because it's not digital and because it's in French. But I'd say that now we're beginning to get a really exciting body of material to work with. When I came into this field, really working on the port of Kambay in Gujarat, and its school of marble carving that developed there, or continued rather, from the pre-Khalji period. So this is carving for Muslim patrons that begins to develop even in the early 13th century, alongside a much bigger production then of for the Jain and Hindu communities in the port, but is a tradition that continued for a very, very long time. And in a footnote from one of the epigraphic publications, I think it's Desai's 1961, first sort of epigraphic publication of some of these epitaphs from Kambay, there's a tiny footnote mentioned somewhere where it says, oh, and I've heard that there are graves like this in Sumatra. It turns out that there are graves like this around most of the Indian Ocean, and they're not just graves like this, they are Kambay produced export production on, if we judge the surviving material, probably a really considerable scale. So just to give you a few tiny examples of what we have, on the top left, I'm showing you a very famous group of Kambay graves that were installed in Gresik in Java. The main figure commemorated is a certain Malik Ibrahim, who died in the equivalent of 1419. I'm showing you a picture documenting restoration works on the graves as a prompt to say that this material was taken incredibly seriously by the Dutch, who began some of the first systematic photographic surveys of cemeteries across Aceh, and that material is still preserved largely in Leiden, where the prints are preserved, but I also many moons ago in Jakarta saw this huge storeroom where the original glass plate prints of lots of this documentation was stored in teak boxes. So it's a really extraordinary archive of material, and it allows us to, and so for example, then on the right, by far the largest group of Kambay tombstones are located in North Sumatra, particularly around what used to be the port polity of Samudra Pasai. And I'm giving you an example here of a footstone of a grave from the equivalent of 1414. What's really interesting about the material that survives in Indonesia is that in Kambay itself, very few cenotaphs and graves have stayed in their original notations or intact. It's very clear that Islamic cemeteries were either built over, or there was perhaps predation of graves for the use of marble in lime burning and things. And so in Kambay, what we mainly have surviving are headstones built into the walls of shrines for safeguarding, with only a few examples of intact cenotaphs. What you get in Pasai, because the region never became a major urban centre once it faded, it became sort of more a question of isolated village settlements. We have complete cenotaphs and a whole body of footstones that survive, giving really important insights into the way that what we tend to see as think of as typical Gujarat cotton textile designs, so these mango tree designs, etc., were probably part of a far bigger decorative repertoire. The printed cottons are often very fine, but they're certainly not elite textiles. And we do have references to velvets and other types of textiles being produced in Gujarat at this period. And we're probably getting here through the marble some insights into far more sophisticated decorative repertoires, most obviously textile, but I'm sure other areas. So oops, let me just try and move down. There we go. So this is already a bit out of date because pieces of Kambay carving keep popping up. But when I worked on this material, this is from 2005, you can see that Southeast Asian elites were importing cenotaphs from Kambat in a very deliberate way with custom designed epitaphs ready carved. We're talking about tons of marble on the move when you consider that a cenotaph is not just headstone, footstones, and then the sides of the cenotaph, but a very complex arrangement also of foundations to stop these sinking into the ground. Some people like to say, oh, well, it's just ballast. And I would say that clever lading of a ship uses ballast that's valuable. if at all possible. So it's clear that, yes, these 12 cenotaphs and tombstones from Pasai probably were laden in a way that enabled the ship to balance its various cargoes and technically also performed a role as ballast. But I think it's still really important to emphasize that we're not talking about the kind of ballast you sometimes see in the Red Sea, which is just worthless volcanic stones put in the bottom of a ship to provide ballast and then discarded at arrival at the port. So these are primarily really luxurious exports of cenotaphs and tombstones. What I wanted to emphasize, I think, in my talk is both the value of these tombstones as epigraphic sources, but material sources for understanding the material culture of North Sumatra and Java in the beginning of Islamization. But also the fact that this area is connected with an Indian Ocean-wide trend for this tombstone, these exports from Kambay. So we have remains of a cenotaph from the Sultanate of Kilwa. We have mosque interior fittings from Mogadishu. And so it goes on. So really emphasizing the interconnectedness of maritime Southeast Asia with the whole Indian Ocean world. And bits and pieces keep turning up. So I'm hoping one day to actually sort of publish the ultimate catalogue of all this material. But to emphasize as well that the exchanges and directions go in multiple, exchanges go in multiple directions. So the new Maritime Asia Heritage Survey work in North Sumatra since the tsunami has been really exceptional in documenting unimported, locally manufactured tombstones of a huge variety of designs, many of them clearly what's now being defined as a local vernacular motifs and styles. So above here, I'm showing you one type of tombstone, particularly associated with the port of Lamre, which is just east of Bandar Aceh, right on the tip of Sumatra, where these designs obviously have no parallel in contemporary material culture because we don't have contemporary mosques and we don't have contemporary locally manufactured textiles or other objects. So they stand out as really important singular pieces of evidence for the development of both local calligraphy styles and phraseologies. We get a lot of Jawi words coming in, but also the existence, as you'd expect, of very strong vernacular motifs and a distinct regional identity. And then scrambling things further on the right, this is a tombstone from Pasai, dated to the equivalent of 1427. And I think all of you will pick up in it the very distinct synicizing nature, both of the calligraphy and of the ornamentation of this mosque lamp. So looking at the feet of the lamp that almost become cloud forms, and then the way that we have sort of chrysanthemum or flower-like forms being developed elsewhere. But I'd say particularly the very linked sinuosity of the calligraphy is distinctly inspired by Chinese material culture and calligraphy. There's nothing to say from the name of the individual on this tombstone that they were a Chinese Muslim, but we're bang in the period of Cheng Ho's maritime voyages, 1427 actually, towards the end of that, with regular stops made throughout maritime Southeast Asia and Pasai, with, we know at the beginning, as Jeff Wade has shown very nicely in his analysis, direct Chinese interventions in issues of local politics and policy. And so it's really interesting to remember that maritime Southeast Asia, as these tombstones are showing us, have this incredible complexity of connections, both to India, which I understand is the focus of today's meeting, but also I'd say eastwards to China, which is an aspect that's still been relatively neglected as a theme of study, but also as a recent article by Michael Feener and other collaborators has brought up through the documentation of Lamre, these really strong, defined indigenous vernacular traditions of motifs and forms. That for the moment, I've looked at Islamic material in South Asia, and there may be some vague parallels, but on the whole, we're talking about something very local and distinctive. And I just wanted then to highlight the importance of this growing, increasingly accessible body of material, thanks to the Maritime Asia Heritage Survey resources, and the possibilities that it's now offering us for doing a parallel study of both developing calligraphic and epigraphic styles, but also understanding a lot more about the material culture of this area. And I think maybe it's difficult to gauge how exceptional these large cemeteries are. So, if we compared to, say, Gujarat and other areas, we have some ancient cemetery areas, but then they're not on the whole on the same scale as we find, all the way from Brunei right through to the tip of Sumatra and in northern Thailand, excuse me. And I've always been interested but unable to substantiate whether there's, in this sort of newly Islamized area, there's a real actually focus on commemoration after death, a really strong importance on the installation of tombstones on the grave. Even if they're uncarved blanks, there seems to be at this period a huge production on, I wouldn't say the word industrial scale, but certainly from the Pasai cemeteries, we know that the form you can see on the right is being produced rote. We get lots of these tombstones that are blank and uncarved, and it's clear that, if you had less budget, you had a plain one. But if you had the money and could commission then a design, you used a local stoneworker to personalize your tombstone. And we have a huge range also of carving styles that seem to testify to very interesting synergies going on between carvers possibly trained in China or South Asia in this flat cut chanlevé technique that you can see. But we have other ones that are carved in a very soft, rounded form that relates to earlier pre-Islamic megaliths in the region. So for me, it's a really exciting area to think about, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was great. I'm sorry, I was probably rushing you a bit.
No.
And thank you also very much for bringing China into the conversation. And of course, the other very important thing, which is amplifying the fact that these interconnections work in multiple directions, that it's not one route, and etc. I'm going to invite William Dalrymple now, who is a multi-award winning historian and writer, and his forthcoming book, The Golden Road, looks at the connected histories of South and Southeast Asia, particularly those that are emanating from India. I can also say that in an earlier conversation, I did confirm with William whether his forthcoming book had yet another title or subtitle, to which he said that's all there is for now. It's going to be The Golden Road, is about all I can say for the moment. But William, please, you're going to show us some slides. So please go ahead.
I'm not going to show some slides, but I will. What I will just say is that, to begin with, that it's really very early in the days of this project of mine to be speaking about it, and I'm very, very flattered to be asked with so many people I've learned from in this field. What I'd like to do, just very briefly, is maybe take off from Daud's fascinating points about the lack of hard information from Indian sources about motives and why what was going on humanly behind the very visible architectural, artistic, epigraphic waves of influence, not once in history, but through the centuries, going largely from India to Southeast Asia, though much comes back in the new collection of essays that Andrea Acri has just produced, Creative South. He uses a very nice phrase, which I like very much, the pizza effect. And he compares this with the way that pizza left Naples, traveled to New York, where people did terrible things like put pineapple on top of it, and then it travels back to northern Italy. And what you often get in northern Italy is the American version of pizza rather than the Neapolitan original. And he's suggests that in many cases you're getting ideas moving from particularly South and East India to Southeast Asia, being developed there by states that are often more powerful, with larger resources, and then sent back. And I think it's very striking. I've just come back from a most wonderful few months in Java and Cambodia, and it's very striking how much larger often the monuments are than in a sense the originals in India. That if you go from Tanjore to Angkor, there's an increase of scale of about 20 times, and yet you can see ideas which are being developed by the Cholas, such as the dance halls in Tanjore, taking off in a slightly different form in Khmer monuments slightly later. So the other thing I'm very intrigued to try and do is to find the human stories, the biographical stories which underlie these processes. And one source which of course is very useful are the lives of monastic biographies and monastic hagiographies, which for all their embroidery and wonderworking provide very interesting individual trajectories along the routes that we're talking, linking India, Southeast Asia, and China, and back again. And the best example, of course, of this is Vajrabodhi and Amoghavajra, who you'll all be very familiar with. Vajrabodhi, 671 to 741, is a wonderworking Buddhist monk and tantric master who was clearly a man of immense learning and charisma. He claimed the power of summoning rain, and to know the mantras or spells capable of destroying enemy armies and even of bringing the dead back to life. He seems in some ways to be rather like a contemporary in this part of the world might be Merlin, a figure who is used by rulers whose arts could be used for political ends. Said in some sources to be the son of a Pallava prince in southern India, he's only 9 when he gets sent to the great Buddhist University of Nalanda, the most sophisticated educational institute in pre-modern Asia. He later spent the years 701 to 8 in South India, where he received initiation into secret tantric formulae, allegedly passed on to him in an iron stupa. Soon after this, he was summoned home by his royal cousins to their capital of Kanchipuram to bring rain during a terrible drought. After precipitating an unseasonable monsoon, he sounds like the kind of character that useful in modern India, given the erratic rain patterns at the moment. Vajrabodhi gets sent as some sort of ambassador to the Emperor of China. This may be possibly linked to the Pallava's search for allies against 2 new enemies that had appeared on the horizon, the Tibetans in the northeast and the Umayyads to the west, or maybe not. Maybe it was other reasons such as trade, which led the Pallavas to send him there. As part of the same diplomatic initiative, it may well be that the Narasimhavarman's Buddhist pagoda, Nagapatnam, that Vidya mentioned earlier, which was built for the use of traders and pilgrims. And he asked the Tang emperor to name it. Vajrabodhi first visited Sri Lanka, where he made the pilgrimage to the Buddha's footprints on Adam's Peak, and to the great Buddhist monastery of Abhayagiri in the capital, Anuradhapura, from which he brought copies of a number of esoteric Buddhist texts. His next stop was Java, where in 717 he met his protege Amoghavajra, 705 to 774, the young nephew of a Sogdian trader from Samarkand. In due course, Amoghavajra would go on to become the most famous and celebrated tantric monk in China. There are, in the Andre Acri edited volume I talked about Creative South, there's a number of fascinating essays which link the possibility of that some of the mandalas that were introduced to Java, possibly by Vajrabodhi, may be reflected in the mysterious mandala forms of Borobudur. And there's a fascinating essay by Swati Chamburka showing possibly that, but also the influence of various smaller and less remarkable, but similar formed stupa mountains in Bihar. In 721, having stilled a raging tempest at sea by their joint powers of tantric meditation, Vajrabodhi and Amoghavajra finally reached the Chinese capital of Chang'an. Here, one of Vajrabodhi's diplomatic gifts, a talking parrot, caused a great stir, but more remarkable gifts were to follow. But in Chanang, Vajrabodhi once again worked his magical rainmaking skills in front of the new Tang emperor, Xuanzong. And this is a quote from one of the lives. Since the first moon of that year, it had not rained for 5 months, but one admiring Chinese monk. Prayer was offered at the sacred temples of mountains and rivers without result. So the emperor ordered Vajrabodhi to set up an altar to pray for rain. In consequence, an altar was erected in the temple where Vajrabodhi lived. He himself painted the image of the Bodhisattva of the 7 kotis and set the date when the eyes of the image were to be drawn in. That day, he guaranteed that rain would come. The emperor sent Master I Sing to observe it secretly. It was still so hot on the 7th day that there was not a single cloud floating in the sky. But in the afternoon, when the eyes of the Bodhisattva were being drawn, northwest winds began to blow so heavily that the clouds of the roof were lifted and the trees were uprooted. Before long, the clouds were dropping with rain. The people far and wide were astonished. A hole was torn in the roof above the altar, and heavy rain poured into the hole. Next month, people of high and low degrees in the capital asserted that Vajrabodhi had managed to seize the rain dragon, which had jumped through the roof, and thousands of people daily sought to see the place. Such is the miraculous effect, wrote the monk, of the effect of tantric altars. In the years that followed, Vajrabodhi and Amoghavajra became some of the most prolific writers and translators in Chinese Buddhist history, bringing new Indic ideas of cosmology, reincarnation, drug prescription, astronomy, horoscopic astrology, calendrical computation, and planetary prediction to the Chinese court. They also initiated pupils across China in their new tantric doctrines, and one of those, Kokai, went on to take his teachings to Japan. Meanwhile, the texts, statues, and paintings that the monks brought with them changed the course of art history. A recent essay by Yuri Koklo has shown how he makes a very convincing case for strong Pallava iconographic and artistic influences in the Buddhist cave complex at Dunhuang. This may well have been, again, linked to objects possibly brought by Vajrabodhi. There's also possible to link statues that Vajrabodhi may have brought from Nalanda with various bronzes in Java and Thailand. Nor was this the end of Amoghavajra's travels. Years later, after the death of his master, he returned to Sri Lanka to access more sacred texts before returning with them to China, where he used his now enhanced tantric skills to protect the imperial order and defeat the Tang enemies. And again, this is a Chinese court account of what Amoghavajra was believed to be responsible for. An edict was issued summoning Amoghavajra to the court of the city of Anhis, as the city of Anhis had been surrounded by enemy troops of 5 nations. Amoghavajra said, "Your Majesty should carry an incense burger to the place where I will conduct the ritual. Your Majesty should pray to the heavenly king of the north to send divine troops to save them." The emperor quickly entered the ritual area and prayed. Before Amoghavajra had recited the secret words twice over, the emperor suddenly saw 200 to 300 divine beings wearing golden armor. In the 4th month of the year, a memorial came from Anhis, which said that at the same day that Amoghavajra had prayed, to the northeast of the city, dark clouds and fogs had appeared. In the fog were beings who were 10 feet tall, and all wore golden armor. After dusk, the sound of drums and loud cries could be heard, and the trembling of the earth stopped after 3 days. The frightened troops of 5 nations all retreated. Moreover, golden rats had chewed the strings of the bows and crossbows and destroyed their weapons, so none could be used. So these sort of human and wonder stories, I think, give sort of flesh and blood to the epigraphy, to the sculpture, to the architecture, which shows the evidence of travels between India and Southeast Asia and China. I'd like to end maybe just by asking a question rather than making any sort of statement. My impression coming into this and reading through the historiography and reading the work of some of the writers that Daud mentioned, like Walters and Kulke, is that it seemed to be that possibly in reaction to the nationalism of historians like R.C. Majumdar of the Greater India School, that you seem to have a very strong reaction against any idea of Indian influence in Southeast Asia, and increasingly Indianization is put in heavily inverted commas, and people are almost frightened to use the word. But it seems to me, this is my question, that that in a sense that seems to reach its peak with scholars such as Claude Jacques and Michael Vickery. And my impression is that possibly you have more recent waves of scholars like Swati Chimbuka talking far more concretely now about Indian influence without sort of using so many hedges and parentheses and inverted commas, that in a sense the pendulum is swinging back. And talking to archaeologists of the EFEO and so on, I had a wonderful time in Siem Reap with Eric Bourdonnais, for example, who's talking very clearly about the kind of the influence of Indic city plans and so on Okeo and Angkor Boré. And I would love to ask all of you whether you get the impression that, in a sense, that there was a strong reaction against the idea of Indianization, which is now giving way to a more specific set of studies showing the various places where there is very clearly Indian influence. But again, I'm very intrigued, and again, that's something I'd love to ask you all, is whether it's probably true that these early states like the Thessalocracy of Srivijaya or the Khmers had much greater resources than most of the Indian states, and that with the exception possibly of the Cholas, which Vidya has spoken so well about, that the ideas which are produced in India are realized on a far greater scale in Southeast Asia, and that monuments like Borobudur and the great Khmer temple pyramids are much larger than the sort of things which have originally inspired them from India. So, as I said, this is early days. Forgive me butting into something like this, but it's very fascinating to listen to, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Okay, thank you very much, William. I'm going to invite Jeffrey, but before that, Daud, did you want to respond to what William just said, since William took off from where you had? I mean, you don't have to at the moment.
No, I mean, I think, I would open this actually to, I think I'm so glad that Elizabeth, is here with us, because what's interesting is, I don't really, so I don't really see it as a kind of pendulum thing. I think the when you were narrating Andrea's work, it didn't sound to me like you were talking about Indian influence. It sounded to me you were, I think the paradigms that scholars are using now are networks and interconnectedness, which is quite different than the idea of unilateral or kind of unidirectional influence. So the idea of influence itself is a kind of weird idea in all cultural histories, because it's kind of born ultimately of astrology itself, the idea that you can be influenced, right? I mean, but I think that Andrea's work highlights highlights the fact that basically what's going on here is you've got this monk who is born in India, who moves in India, but is he Indian? I mean, he's as much a person of the world, and I mean, to call that Indian influence to me is to very much impoverish his career. Sure. The other thing about the Indian influence, which I think that older generation completely restricted it to what it considered to be Indic, which means Hindu and Buddhist. Elizabeth's work has shown so emphatically, I mean, not just Elizabeth's work, there's other work, has shown that even Islam, when it goes to Southeast Asia, also has a complex kind of complex mediation, let's say, through often notional and real, kind of connections with Mabar, the area that's crossed, right, which is the Arabic word for South India, and not to mention Gujarat. And so, that never entered and is not part of that older scholarship. So I think there really have been advances, and it's not such a, the pendulum swinging back, and now we need to return to the idea of Greater India. I mean, that I think is thankfully buried. I mean, I think in
a sense, though, what I'm saying is that by the older generation scholars extending it far further into the political realm than was warranted, and dreaming of Hindu colonies with Hindu kings, that obviously has long disappeared from the frame. But it is nonetheless true that it is, you're getting Indian religions, Vaishnavite, Shaivite, Buddhist, Indian sculptural forms, Indian forms of epigraphy, and they're moving from west to east. You're not getting inscriptions in Southeast Asian languages coming back to India. You're not getting the cults of pre-Indic Southeast Asia appearing in Gujarat, and so on. Yeah.
But
so when you have the idea of
that
convergence,
civilization or not?
Again?
Is that civilizing? Do we want to use that word?
No, we don't want to use that word. I agree.
I don't know. I mean,
but it's yeah.
But I hear you. There is a sense in which there's these tremendous cultural forms of Hinduism, of Buddhism, and Islam, all coming out of South Asia. But I guess what I would say is that my feeling about that is that what you're saying is also true, that how they evolve in Southeast Asia is unique and distinctive. And I don't know what the evidence is for the pizza effect, which
the pineapple toppings.
Yeah. But I think that's a fascinating and tantalizing proposition, and I'd love to hear what Vidya thinks about this. But that these mega temple complexes that you find in Southeast Asia, how they actually size up, as you say. My impression about Angkor, just as a layman traveling to the site, was exactly what you're saying. But are they having, is there a kind of dialogue that's going on? And that would suggest that, it is more complicated than one-way influence. It's much more of a kind of multi-directional thing. So, yeah.
If I may just jump in for a minute.
Yeah, Vidya, and then you, Elizabeth. But could I just say before that we're enjoying this discussion very much, but I cannot deny feeling somewhat triumphant, because the discussion that all of you have not been part of is the discussion that went behind using the title for this event as we did. So we had discussions about networks, interconnected histories, connected histories, etc., and everything that you can think of. And what was interesting was that we finally decided to call it connected histories. And we said connected histories in South and Southeast Asia. We didn't say between or and. And these were all very conscious choices of words for precisely the reasons that all of you are raising. So we're really very delighted. Vidya, please speak now, and then you, Elizabeth.
Just very briefly. If you look at an image form that originated in India, let's say just Ganesha for the moment, the fact that you can distinguish very clearly a Ganesha from Cambodia, which is different from a Ganesha from Vietnam, which is utterly different from a Ganesha from Indonesia, which is different from a Ganesha from Thailand. In other words, the individual areas are developing in independent ways. They are not referring back at least. That much is very clear. It's just something that is, if you talk about the pizza effect, it is the American pizza or the Chicago deep dish pizza, which is all developed, which we're talking about here. So just to throw that in, and of course the fact that Borobudur is still a mystery. Is it a Chandi? Is it a mandala? Is it a stupa? You know, shows the complexity of what is developing out there. I'll leave it to Elizabeth to go on with her comment.
I mean, it follows on very nicely. I was just going to make the point that it's very easy to slip into using a very old vocabulary. I mean, art historians hate the word influence. Inspiration is hyper dangerous. And I was thinking, you know, more than this sort of implicitly talking about some kind of imposition from South Asia to Southeast Asia, it's much more interesting to think about agency in Southeast Asia, active choices, translation, appropriation, and also wondering, you know, what is not taken, and giving that agency to Southeast Asia in these exchanges. So that's all I wanted to say.
Jeffrey, did you want to come in?
Oh yes, yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the four presentations, and really I had absolutely no idea what they were going to talk about right before, you know, you spoke. So I kind of anticipated, you know, that these are some of the critical questions that, you know, will be asked during this session. I think there's a lot to discuss, but we have only so much time, right? I think the flow went very well. I think Daud set the whole context, right? The broader historiographical context of this topic, right? But he also said something very interesting, which is, you know, that the culture that was exported to so-called exported to Southeast Asia was not really fully formed. You know, I think that was really, I think it's an important point as well, right? And then, you know, Vidya and Elizabeth came in with their very interesting, you know, kind of nuggets of information, you know, about the Cholas and also the Muslim cemeteries. And then William kind of summed it up, you know, very nicely, and brought us back again to the grand debate, right, about you know, the extent, right. I think this whole title is as Nilanjan said, is a relevant one, consciously chosen, but I think also a very contentious one, right. And it has always been that. I mean, you know, I suppose much has been written about this topic, and it has been intensely debated for more than a century. You know, I think Southeast Asia has been given the, you know, names like Further India, Greater India, as mentioned by Daud, you know, Greater Indian Society and all that. And even the names in Indonesia and Indochina suggest this, right? And but I think more recently also, as William mentioned, or Daud, right, there's been a shift in historiographic trends, okay, especially in the past decades among historians of Southeast Asia, right, between the so-called Indo-centric and the indigenous schools, right? So I think perhaps it's about time we look from things from the perspective of Southeast Asia, right? I think almost nothing has been written about, right, what impact did Southeast Asia have on India? Perhaps not much, you know, compared to the flow from the other side, okay? But I also note, like Vidya was saying about the Sailandras, the Srivijaya Empire sponsoring temples, right? You know, to be built in India. And I think there's a record of a Sailandra king also, right, sponsoring a temple in Nalanda itself, if I'm not mistaken, right? So I think that kind of, yeah, I think it's interesting to note, right? Yeah, so if I may, I took down some notes. If you can get the discussion going. I think, Elizabeth, you did mention about the Muslim, you know, and I think from Elizabeth's presentation, we see that this kind of influence is not a one-way thing, it's multi-directional, it's not even two-way, right? And, you know, and from Vidya's presentation, you know, we recognize that there were geopolitics at play even then, right? Between India and China, even now, right, still going on. So I think what was happening then is still highly relevant today, right? So let me just kind of I have some questions here. Yeah. So Elizabeth, can I ask you the question about the Kambay Graves? I think that's quite interesting. So, I mean, who were I mean, you mentioned that they were probably used as ballast, right? In a way. But
no,
not really, right?
It's not their primary function, and
yes,
I'd rather
correct.
you didn't think of their primary function.
Okay, sorry. But who were the people who kind of ordered these tombstones, from? You mentioned the elites, right? They were mainly the elites, and
yes,
who were the one who brought them over? Were there middlemen, and who were these middlemen?
So it's an area where we don't have written sources about this. They're being ordered by, in most places, the daughter of the Sultan's grave, for courtiers, for the top level of the Sultanate of Pasai. I've argued that they're actually very complex to put together and install these cenotaphs. It's not something rather like an IKEA flat pack where you send it off and leave somebody else to figure it out at the other end. So I've argued really that these big, especially the bigger commissions where you've got a cenotaph involved and tons of marble going out, that you're probably talking about teams of stonemasons going. People often think of some people think of stonemasons as quite static and unmoving, but actually there's quite a lot of evidence for their mobility, even in medieval India. And so, in my opinion, they probably did actually travel with a small team to set them up in situ and install them properly and assemble them.
Right. So didn't the local, artisans develop the expertise to construct these tombstones?
What you have to understand that craftsmanship often relates very closely to the material they're using, and stone isn't one material. So the way you carve marble is not the way you carve the local stones from North Sumatra, which are mainly volcanic stones and are often carved by pounding or erosion. Marble's very different. And so we've got some nice examples, for example, of a Kambay tombstone that was delivered for a governor of Zofar in southern Oman. And it's very clear that the epitaph was left empty to be filled out, and local stone carvers had no technological ability to actually carve marble. And we have a very messy, very different end to the epitaph. So no, these were not things that people working with, quite small basaltic rocks would have known how to carve or assemble and fit neatly together. So I'm certain that they would have needed adjustment in situ, etc.
Yeah. So which leads me to the next question, which was brought up by a few of you, William and Vidya as well, about the monuments in Southeast Asia, right? We have George Stedes, right? George Stedes, the venerable scholar of Southeast Asian, right, art, who claimed that monuments such as Angkor, Thom, and the Bayon, right, and he claimed that these monuments, there's nothing resembling them in India. But yet he claimed that they were products of Indian genius. And but however, later he acknowledged that although the inspiration is from India, the execution was the work of indigenous artisans who possessed traditions and knowledge for their pre-Indian past. So apparently the locals did acquire that expertise, right, to construct these monuments. Although the end result might be quite different, right? Perhaps aesthetically as well, right, from those you see in India. Perhaps Vidya, you want to say something about that? Yeah.
Well, the subject matter may be partly is obviously from the subcontinent in its origins, but the workmanship is certainly a local development. It does go in slightly different ways in each of those areas. And I think that is the proof that there is no one single source, because it comes early and then in each area, it develops differently. So Angkor in Cambodia is a different development from Java, which is a different development from Champa, which is again different. So it is local developments, and it's local genius, if you want to call it that. It is that's happening. As opposed to, there never was, I don't believe that there ever was any control or reference necessarily back to India. Once this moved, it then developed in its own way in these various areas. There was no reference back to India mainland or any idea of that sort for any inspiration. And influence is, as Elizabeth said, one of those words which is to be dropped from our vocabulary. It's a dangerous one, because I mean, influence suggests that it is, I mean, there are wonderful writings on not using the word influence, because influence suggests that it is that it is India influencing here, while it's actually the people from Indonesia or Malaysia or wherever who selectively will take. So it is more, the influence gives the wrong idea that wherever the influence comes from is the master thing. It isn't. It is there, and you are extracting out of it what you want. I mean,
yeah,
we won't go into further discussion on influence, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, it suggests a passivity on the one receiving that we really react strongly against, certainly as art historians, and I'm sure as historians as well.
Could I just ask Vidya, while she has the mic, to comment on this issue of gigantism and scale that seems to be a feature of the end of the first millennium in India, but a little earlier in Southeast Asia. I mean, that's my impression.
Daud, I'd probably refer that back to you by saying that isn't it an assertion of kingship and a function, because those are royal monuments. So is it the necessity, the desire to establish themselves in a way? Are they looking elsewhere and thinking about it in those terms? Yes, the monuments really are amazing. It must have something to do with the idea of kingship and authority. That's what I'm thinking. It's one of those mysteries.
But do you think that the pizza effect could be going on, in the sense that somehow there could be some understanding on the part of Indic polities that seem to go for these very large temples, like temple complexes at this, at the end of the first millennium? But maybe that's because, I mean, I think, now that I think about it, we have, Patadakal and, Ihole, and there's, maybe it's not as, gigantism isn't the thing, but scale is huge, right? But so, I mean, I was, William's idea of from Akri, of this idea of, something going to a quote unquote export product going from India, which is okay, worship in temples, but there might be some evidence or stylistic trace that we can find of some sort of feedback coming back from those areas. I don't know. I mean, it seemed tantalizing to me, and I've always thought about that, thinking, wow, a Brihadishvara, gigantic temple, and then you see, some of the temples in, Angkor Wat itself. It seems even larger. I mean, I don't know if it is. But you know,
it is. I mean, I think it is developing in its very own, and the interesting thing is that it's developing its own way in Cambodia very differently from what is happening at Champa in Vietnam, and very differently from what's happening either in Indonesia. So each of these areas is taking a kernel and then expanding in. I wish we had more information. Well, yes, there was some contact, but it doesn't seem. I mean, it's one of those conundrums. You started by mentioning one conundrum. This is another of those conundrums, I think.
I'm going to invite Elizabeth and William. I do want to hear, we all want to hear your views on this whole question of scale and etc. But it's interesting that Daud mentioned Patadakal and Aihole. I haven't been to Angkor myself, but I remember having gone from places like Tanjavur and Mahabalipuram and etc. to places like Patadakal and Aihole. And one is struck immediately by the expanse of it, if not the monumentality, the expanse of it in relation to two other far more assertive and dominant temples. Elizabeth, I know you want to say something, but before that, could I just say once again, patting ourselves on the back, that on another occasion, which is perhaps not as public as this one, I will tell all of you the story behind the whole conversation that we had at LSE over not using influence as a word. And the reason I make this point is not only because we're in complete agreement with what you're saying, but a point that Elizabeth made only in passing, which is that I think we also need to acknowledge and recognize that influence is a very, very problematic and in many senses unfair word to use, even for historians, not just for art historians, even for historians, for textual historians. And one of the things that came up in the discussion was that, apart from what Elizabeth said, that there's this implied thing of passive reception, there is also a word like influence, and yes, English is a finite language and there are only those many words, and we can keep adding nuance to it. I get all that, but influence does also have sometimes a very unnecessary element of tangibility to it, if you use that word in relation to what you are rightly referring to as inspiration, etc., etc. But just wanted to say that we did have quite a lot of discussion over not using that word. Elizabeth, you wanted to say something, and then William. Your microphone is off.
Sorry, not at all a specialist on the pre-Islamic period, but it just struck me that if you wanted to start to unpick, gigantic size as an architectural historian, you'd be thinking about command of resources, you'd be thinking about structures of patronage, whether you've got multiple communities patronizing smaller temples, or whether you've got some kind of centralized monopoly of resources. So, it's certainly for Roman architectural history and other things, you're thinking about that ability to command both manpower and resources of all sorts to then build on that scale, and that might give you some interesting insights indeed into the state of agricultural development, but also ideas of kingship in Southeast Asia versus India. But not my area at all, but that's just where I'd start digging down. I'm sure people have, so I'm sure people will pop in to tell me it's been done.
William?
I mean, just in sheer scale, I mean, what is very striking is that particularly the Khmer monuments are vastly bigger. I think I've read a figure somewhere that you could fit 20 of the Tanjore Big Temple into the full outer enclosure of Angkor Wat. I mean, it is a different order, and yet you see ideas passing. The small dance halls built in Tanjavur seem to be picked up on by the Khmers and then built on a larger scale. And the same is true just of images of the Buddha. It's apparently isn't it always said to be the Northern Way who were the first to build the very, very large Buddhism, and then it travels back to Afghanistan. Bamyan is influenced by by work in China. That again, you have something sort of going backwards towards the heartland of Buddhism. But it's very interesting, and I think, you know, we're blindly using the word Indian as if there's a nation state there, when I think one of the key and most interesting features of India during this period is that it is almost always very fragmented into many, many different states who are often at war with each other. So the Cholas against the Pallavas, or the Chalukyas against the Pallavas, and so on. While the Khmer kings seem to establish much larger bodies of manpower and are able to, through the hydraulic work that they're doing, irrigating vast areas of Cambodia, seem to be able to get much larger resources, much larger workforces, and seem to have the ability to work on a completely different scale to say the Chalukyas, and Aiholi and Patadakal are magnificent, and some of my most happy hours have been wandering around them, but they're not, you know, there's nothing even beginning to compare in scale to what's going on at the same time in Cambodia.
Thank you very much, William, and thank you also for making the point that when we use India as a shorthand, I mean, you know, it has to be taken on board what the nature of that
the same
was.
The same is of course true of China, which you know is not what China is today, and we're apt to transpose modern nation states onto old polities. But there is a difference, I think, between the scale of the Chinese empire over most of the period we're talking about, and the fractured nature of the polities, often in these mandala forms, often at war with each other or making alliances against a third party, which is the norm for most of Indian history.
No, it's terribly interesting. You know, I mean, particularly when you consider that I don't believe a coinage has been found for the Khmer Empire. You know, so I mean, it's an empire that's able to mobilize vast amounts of resources without in an entirely non-monetized economy, and maybe that's the key to it. You know, I don't know. But that's, I mean, it's a very good point you've raised about, you know, and this is what the theme of an earlier generation of historians was really very much about, that, you know, what is Srivijaya Empire? It's one of those empires that, you know, well, does it exist? Does it not exist? I mean, you know, Pierre-Yves Manguin, you know, in his work on, you know, on the Srivijaya Empire, and the structure of these island empires is quite different, and their relations, for example, with upland resources in non-agrarian empires that, you know, largely subsisted entirely on the coasts and lived by accessing raw materials from groups that they had patron-client relationships, but not necessarily control over, that lived in interior parts. I mean, this occurred to me the first time I took a flight from, I think it was Kuala Lumpur or Singapore to Kuching in Malaysia, and you go along the coastline and the density of forest, it goes on for, I mean, it's nothing like I've seen in anywhere in India, except maybe the Sundarbans, but even there, it's not quite like what you see in northern Borneo. And so, you know, there were real climatic and environmental differences that many of these maritime empires faced compared to the landed empires. I mean, you know, the small agrarian empires or even large agrarian empires in contemporary India. So, yeah, that's something that also needs to be brought into the mix.
There are no questions, but I'm going to read out a comment that's just come in, because it's not, I mean, all comments are relevant, but this one is particularly interesting. I'll just read it out. Another point to consider in Angkor is that it is a large-scale anthropogenic landscape. The Siem Reap River is canalized and diverted from its former natural flow within Angkor Thom. Excavations I have worked on have up to 3 to 4 meters of redeposited soil as a result of landscape modification. That's just very Jeffrey, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just want to say this last point, that about, I suppose, the intra-regionalism, right? I think that's outside the purview of this topic, but I thought that that's something that, would be quite crucial as well, right? The kind of, the networking, the connections, right, within the region itself, okay? And I kind of look at a text by our own art historian, T.K. Sabapati, and he was talking about this kind of intra-regional connections, and it's interesting that he mentioned about Jayavarman II, right? Jayavarman II of the Kambay king, and who was actually said to have sought refuge in Java, right, from some succession disputes in Cambodia, and he actually returned to establish the Angkor Empire in 802. Okay, and when he returned to Angkor, he actually brought back with him conceptions of kingship, right, as well as temple architecture from Java, right? And we always thought that, that the kind of, this actually was, these ideas of divine kingship, the Devarajas, were actually kind of exported from India, but actually, Java itself perhaps played a role in this as well, right? So that the kind of intra-regional influence is kind of noteworthy, I thought. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. We are 15 minutes beyond our time, but there's just one brief thing I wanted to raise with all of you, because it came up in the discussion, and I think we should round that off, which is that, and it's also interestingly, when all of you were talking, I was thinking, I am myself an example of the problem that we are grappling with over here, which is that, are there extensive writings, and this question is to all of you, are there extensive writings of inspiration and connections in the other direction, which we briefly referred to over here, and Jeffrey said something as well, that Southeast Asian, in the South Asian region, not necessarily India as we understand it today, but South Asian region. Is there anyone who's published in the English language or in any other language? Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Very different area that we haven't really talked about, but there's a PhD done at the University of Oxford a couple of years ago by Tom Huggevorst, looking at boat technologies and loanwords, really. And he's shown very convincingly that in terms of linguistically, a lot of South Indian terms and boat forms all relate to Austronesian sources. So again, we're talking, sort of possibly first millennium BCE, and there's similarly a great deal of archaeobotanical evidence, so using ancient DNA, looking at the transfer of various foodstuffs, and even things like the chicken that come from maritime Southeast Asia and travelize via South Asia. So maybe not the things that historians would traditionally think about looking at, but food and boat technology, foodstuffs and boat technology definitely go Southeast Asia to South Asia at an earlier period.
Did you want to say something?
What would South India be without the idli? I think that's supposed to be a technology of preparing a fermented kind of steamed, kind of almost a South Indian equivalent of a dumpling, I dare say, that seems to come from Southeast Asia. So.
Vidya, did you want to say anything?
No, sure, there's DNA evidence, but I'm not sure that of course will help us with the monumentality of some of the monuments. So we're talking of a different phase, but yes, the DNA evidence is very interesting. And
there's also a larger question that we haven't touched upon at all, which is the whole question of travel and movement in the Indian Ocean, and there's the widest frame that holds these conversations in place. William, you have the last word. Your microphone is off.
I was just thinking that one of the areas where you can show influence from, I guess, a pizza effect influence backwards and forwards is the life of Atisha, starting in South India, going to going to Srivijaya, where he spends 10 years. Then he comes back and he goes up to Tabo. And you have very interesting parallels apparently between the murals in the Dukang in Tabo and some of the stone sculptures on Borobudur that they're borrowing from the same iconographical tradition and different variants of it. So Atisha, I think, is a very important figure to throw into the story.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, this is very, very interesting. And we've just had a comment about the whole idea of food and the discussion around food, etc., which is interesting because some of it actually came up in the event we did in Michaelmas term as part of this series, which was on food and art, etc. But this has been absolutely wonderful. And I'm delighted we were finally able to put this panel together. It's done exactly what we were hoping that it would do. So thank you very much. In no particular order, Elizabeth Lambourne, Daud Ali, William Dalrymple, Vidya Dehejia, and our collaborators, Jeffrey Say, on behalf of LaSalle College of the Arts in Singapore. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.